Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us for the post-show commentary, the Shadowcast. I am here with Russell Zimmerman, one of the devs for Anarchy, as well as for other Shadowrun systems, Shadowrun editions, should say, and one of our prolific fiction writers as well. So welcome, Rusty. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, Rem, thanks for having me.
Um, Welcome to the chat, everyone. As we talk here, we've got kind of an agenda to go over here and chat and get to know Rusty a little bit. But feel free to drop some questions in the chat. We'll make sure we answer them before we cut off the stream today. I feel like it's this awkward like context moment that I have to fill in because I know you so well, Rusty. So I forget that everyone else doesn't have the same knowledge I do. So why don't you tell us a little bit about you and your work in game dev and all that stuff?
Sure. You're going to notice Rem calling me Rusty. All my writing credits are Russell, so that I sound a little bit less like a dog. And now she's mortified, which is hilarious. But yeah, it's Russell Zimmerman is my name. I have been a Shadowrun geek almost as long as Shadowrun has been a thing. Christmas of 1989, the year it came out, I was supposed to be buying Christmas gifts for other people, and instead I squirreled away for myself a copy of Shadowrun First Edition, fell in love with the cover art, fell in love with the intro fiction of Ghost Dodger and Sally Sung in that seminal cover art and intro fic. One of the highlights of my Shadowrun career was actually the Anarchy 2050 book, where I got to write fiction with Ghost, Sally, and Dodger. So
that's so cool. Full circle.
Yeah. So I have been a fan of Shadowrun forever. I've been a freelancer for Shadowrun, or my gird, 12 or 13 years now.
Wow.
Which makes me feel really old. But yeah, I started with I think Attitude was my first work back in fourth edition. Yeah, so it's been a while, but
so you've survived fourth, fifth, and sixth edition and Shadowrun Anarchy.
Yeah, and so have most of my characters. So yeah, I've transitioned in recent years away from sourcebook and rule writing, more into fiction, but I do still roll up my sleeves and crunch numbers every now and then. I wrote the Adept chapter for Street Weird here in 6th edition.
Oh, cool.
So lots of fun Adept powers, including some kind of crossover ones with Earth Dawn, which is a whole bag of, I don't know, bag of worms, whatever. Anyways, it's a whole thing.
For those new to Shadowrun as well, an Adept is a mage, but like more of internal power-up kind of stuff, and that's what Rio plays as an Adept.
Yeah, so
or Christian plays Rio.
Less Gandalf, more Street Fighter, right? They're still doing overtly magical stuff, but most of it is internalized, and they augment themselves. So they're almost a little closer to like a street samurai than a mage in how they play most of the time. But also, adepts aren't all combat oriented. You can be an artist adept, or like a really good talker face, or a wheelman, or whatever. So yeah, I wrote that. I also wrote the recent Drake's book, Lawfor's Legion. So I've written some crunch for 6th edition, and I've played some 6th edition over on Shadowrun Origins podcast. But mostly I'm doing fiction these days. And a lot of it, not least of which, because I've also recently started to write Battletech, which is another Catalyst property that I've been a fan of for ages. So it's been really cool to get my stompy robot on.
Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about your fiction, Rusty, because I kind of got to know Rusty from Russell.
It's fine, honestly. It's okay.
I started meeting you when I met the Shadowcasters Network folks, and we were streaming on like parallel shows, but not always together. And so I was like, oh my gosh, he hangs out with the Shadowcasters, and he writes the really popular novels, which, by the way, like, as much as I knew that, I still haven't read Jimmy. It's like one of those ones that I know I'm going to get to. So
yeah.
But tell us a little bit about the fiction work that you've done for Shadowrun.
Yeah, probably the most popular or known of my fiction, which is about half of it, has been for a character named Jimmy Kincaid, who is a very kind of old school noir PI type of guy, down to the rumpled coat and the fedora. Only he happens to be an elf. He happens to be most of a mage. Wizards and magicians and stuff in Shadowrun can lose their magic and become what's called a burnout. And you can do that by getting cyberware, or depending on the edition, by being addicted to things, or by being attacked by certain creatures. Back in the olden days of like first edition, you could even risk magic loss just by taking a certain amount of damage.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and then it was harder for doctors to treat you afterwards
Oh,
unless they
wow.
took a target number penalty to preserve your holistic yada yada. So it's like, think trying to eat gluten free and organic and vegan at once compared to going to McDonald's, right?
Mhm.
So it used to be a lot riskier on the magic attribute front. But anyway, so Jimmy, being kind of a blend of the old and new, is what's called a burnout mage, in that he still has all of his knowledge, which is a lot. He's got a master's degree in Hermetic Studies, right? But he's lost his oomph. So think of somebody that's a really, really good mixed martial artist that suddenly has the strength of a 9-year-old or whatever, right? So he's got knowledge and technique and tricks, but not mojo anymore.
Right. Power.
So he's having to deal with stuff in different ways. He's having to lean on help from a lot of friends. And he's trying to balance it all. And his series kind of gets more and more Shadowrun the more into it you get. He's initially just try to be a noir PI and solve little problems, and then things just escalate on him as the series progresses. And I'd say if I'm known for anything in my fiction, it's that I don't write Shadowrunners most of the time. I wrote the iconic fifth edition crew that are often used for cover art and stuff. It's Sledge and Gentry and Coy Dog and Miss Myth.
You created that?
Yes, I had the cover art for fifth edition to work with, but I made up all their names. I statted them up for the box sets and all that fun stuff. And
I didn't know that.
yeah, and I made up Miss Myth completely, which I'm exceptionally proud of because she's dope. So I've written Shadowrunners, but most of my fiction, I'm writing somebody that interacts with Shadowrunners. So it's a private eye or a bounty hunter or a paramilitary merc type of guy, or my most recent novel, which is in the pipeline right now, I'm actually writing a corporate executive. And it's really hard to try and make him a good guy, right? Because just they're innately predatory and evil and bad, even more than in real life. But yeah, so I think I pulled it off, and it's neat. I always try to just write things that fit in the Shadowrun universe without necessarily being about Shadowrunners, because I think that's where there's a little bit more room for cool stories that feel less like an RPG session. Like, I think a lot of times if you just write a novel about a generic Shadowrunner team that takes a job and something goes wrong and then they barely pull it out at the end, it's like, that's just like a bunch of published adventures. That's just like a bunch of campaigns that people play. In the same way, I don't want to write a novel about a generic D&D party going to a dungeon.
It can feel formulaic. I mean, you've got the Johnson meet, you've got the legwork phase, you've got the actual
run
job. Run
and
or
then
job.
The thing that goes wrong, and then so I try to kind of avoid that, and instead I like to just find weird stuff in the setting books and focus on that. Cool. All my Kincaid stories are focused on the Puyallup neighborhood, which is not like Puyallup in real life. It's this very like rural farmland space, but it's you have to respect the Shadowrun lore that was written those many moons ago.
So
I focus there, or my corporal guy focuses on one company and lots of their politics going on. I've got a novel in the works that's set in the Mojave Desert, which is very just like weird and post-apocalypse. It's, a lot of Shadowrun is real life dialed up until the knob breaks, and that's very much true of the Mojave. So rereading some of the old Mojave source books that touch on that. So yeah, I just like to kind of find a weird thing and focus on that and be kind of one step removed from your average Shadowrun.
For the Jimmy Kincaid series, I always mess up what order are they in, because I know there's the short stories in there too.
Yeah, it kicked off with a novella called Neat, which is kind of what restarted a lot of the fiction. And Neat feeds into a trilogy that is Shaken, Stirred, and On the Rocks. And then kind of fitting in anywhere after Neat and before the end of the trilogy, there's a novella called Chaser. There's a short story, or an enhanced fiction, it's called, that's just called Adversary, which is stats for a mentor spirit in 6th edition.
Oh, cool.
So it's a very short story. And then there's a couple anthology things that he popped up in, and Dirty Tricks, which was the politics book back in like 4th and 5th edition. So I snuck him into some intro fictions and this, that, and the other. But I would go like Neat, Chaser, and then hit the trilogy of novels, and you're pretty safe.
Cool. So for those of you who haven't checked out any of the fiction yet and want to get more into these stories, like that's really, I say this every episode of Shadowcast that we do. The purpose of the series was we made it for a new audience of Shadowrun. If you're an experienced Shadowrun, like one of the things I listened to today, the way they do, the way Jason did the grid Overwatch division score, the God score, and how it decreases is if you want to play by the rules, that's not the rules, but we're telling a story. He didn't have it on hand and didn't want to stop the scene, so kept it going and made a decision, which is what we're doing. We're telling a story and getting people into the world, the setting, the characters. And Russell's books are a great way to keep that high going. When you're done with the series, we have 2 episodes left. There's so much fiction out there. There's 35 years of fiction now. So check it out.
One quick note, if you do want to check out the Jimmy Kincaid stories and start with the novella Neat, look instead for Sprawl Stories Volume 1.
Ooh.
It's a collection of like 3 or 4 novellas that add up to one novel, and it's like $2 on Kindle. But it's mine, and it's got really cool stuff by Jen Brozick, Dylan Bertolo's in that one.
Oh, cool.
And Rat R.L. King.
Cool.
So you can't go wrong getting 3 novellas for $2. So
if you watch this today or first thing tomorrow, there is the Shadowrun Legends book Humble Bundle right now, so you can also get a ton of fiction.
Yeah, and that's going to be the really old school foundational stuff that made the world that the rest of us are now telling cool stories in. So it's a great bundle.
Cadillac Jack talked about that they have the audiobook series of the Kincaid series.
Nice.
To listen to. I've done one story.
The voice actors have been killing it on those.
Well, thank you, because I'm one of them for R.L. King's Wolf and Buffalo. So that one's out. That's a novella. Nice. And then I'll also be for the Shadowrun Legends, the Born to Run trilogy by Steve Kenson, who now works for Green Ronin, which I'm obsessed with. I'll be the narrator for that trilogy as well.
Awesome. Yeah, Steve's good people. He just everything he does is good.
He's a kind human being.
Like he's morally good, but also skilled at what he does.
Yeah,
both goods. Anyways, that's where I'm at on the fiction front.
Cool.
Russell Zimmerman, it's out there. You can find it, and I believe it.
Now, with your prolific Shadowrun writing experience, I've got some questions for you based off of today's episode.
Absolutely.
Awesome. So I wanna ask you a few things. We had a lot of heavy role play, which was wonderful. So the only like rules and mechanic-y stuff that came up was really about street docs. We talked a little bit about dock wagon, BioWare, cyberware, and healing. So let's start a little bit like let's dip our toe in first. So
Yeah.
what is a street doc?
A street doc is an illegal doctor. It's someone that is operating essentially a criminal or black market surgery clinic. So it might be because they're a failed doctor. It could be somebody that dropped out of med school or whatever. It could be somebody that is a failed doctor in that they made the moral choice and treated a patient that couldn't pay the hospital, or there's lots of ways to fail in Shadowrun that make you a criminal and a Shadowrunner, but not actually a failure, right?
Mhm.
So it could be somebody that's kind of drummed out of the medical profession. I used to run one on a bulletin board system, Shadowland BBS, shout out to 1998 or so, that was a vet. And
Aw.
not, by which I do not mean a veteran, but like was a vet, and did not have the best like medicine score, but was just, hey, he can pull a slug out of you probably, you know. So it's somebody like that it just, for whatever reason, they're running a bootleg black market street clinic, which also often comes with some unsavory ties because you got to get parts from somewhere, right? And you got to do something with the parts that you take out, and you've got to somehow score the medicines you need, and all that. So there's lots of traditional street docs being very entangled with criminal syndicates or
Mhm.
the bigger gangs in the setting. There's also some kind of semi-legit street docs. There is a hospital in the Puyallup district of Seattle that has an unpronounceable um, Irish Celtic / Elven name that I'm not gonna try, and you can't make me. But it's basically an abandoned hospital that was in a racial Elven ghetto, that has an all volunteer staff. So you've got like this big bad street gang, the Ancients, which are like the biggest biker gang in the setting, but only elves. So they're also like all cool glam rockers from the late 80s, right? But like they do a lot of Robin Hood give back type of stuff. And some of that is like running drugs to this hospital, right? So there's this kind of good Samaritan, all volunteer, full on hospital
Mhm.
in one of the worst neighborhoods in
Hmm.
Seattle. And there's always room for that little bit of good. So there's some street docs that maybe got drummed out for ethics violations and they're feeding people to ghouls or whatever, and they could be really bad. But you can also have street docs that are just doing really good that don't quite fit in the kind of medical industrial complex of Shadowrun.
Cool.
So
So with being a street doctor comes the implication of healing. So how does healing work? Let's start with the sciency way. How does healing work in the sixth world?
yeah, a lot of it is going to vary from edition to edition rather heavily. For people that are really interested in this one, there is a supplement that came out for, I want to say, fifth edition, that was called Bullets and Bandages.
Ooh.
And it's just kind of advanced medical rules for that edition, but it's also got a bunch of lore for Dock Wagon, which I know we're going to talk
Oh,
about soon.
yeah. Yeah.
But so you can get kind of complicated with them. Back in third edition, there were rules for your augmentations and stuff going bad over time. Like, running a 5-year-old laptop, only it's your arm.
Like
right? Like
LASIK.
that's not really great. If you see a really good gamer trying to play on, I don't know, a touchscreen laptop with 30 frames per second, that's bad. So just imagine that, only now like it's your arm that's not that good anymore,
Yeah.
or your eyes. So there have been rules in the past for your gear just becoming obsolete, and you need to kind of stay state of the art and upgrade it with firmware patches and this, that, and the other. We've moved away from that level of granularity a bit, which I think is good for playability. But yeah, the quickest and dirtiest way to get healed in Shadowrun is with just like a basic, like a med kit, which is just what it sounds like, only amped up to like a Shadowrun tech level. So super cool blood clotters and antibiotic sprays, and some sort of super glue foam type of stuff to staunch a wound. Did you guys know super glue started out as a medical thing, like to stop bleeding?
Oh,
True
wow.
story. Yeah, even today you can just dump a bunch of super glue on a cut and it'll patch right up. That's
Noted.
also that's also why nerds like me get stuck to our minis pretty often when we're trying to put together Warhammer stuff. It's because it's made to bond with human skin. Um, but yeah, so you just have this like super cool med kit that can kind of pilot itself sometimes. A lot of them will have like an onboard AI type of thing that goes through what you're supposed to do. And sometimes you can roll your skill and then just get a bonus for having the good gear. Sometimes a GM might give you a penalty if you don't have good gear. If you take a couple shots in the leg and you don't have a med kit on you, maybe it's time to try like using your belt as a tourniquet, and you're
Yeah.
going to get some penalties on that roll to try and, patch yourself up or whatever.
And
So
different levels of med kits are going to do
yeah,
more or less too, right?
yeah. And there's lots of kind of granularity there and room for GMs to interpret based on what's going on and the situation and the type of injury and all that. Um, and then there's how that interacts with magical healing, which gets kind of hand wavy at times. And it's one of the things that you need to watch out for when you're writing Shadowrun fiction, is you don't want to take away any sense of threat, but like functionally, any spellcaster in Shadowrun can learn the health spells that treat injuries and heal wounds. There's no split between like wizards and clerics like in classic D&D or whatever.
Mhm.
So you can be a totally badass fireball throwing mage that was trained by the military, and really, if you think about it, there's no reason that they wouldn't also teach you how to save a life,
Yeah.
because getting a new spell is pretty cheap, right? So it's one of the things that you have to kind of keep in mind in the fiction and when GMing, is that any mage in a story can kind of, literally hand wave away a lot of damage. But there's some interesting cross sections there. Like you can't do multiple magical healing of the same set of wounds. I've got a story where somebody takes a couple rifle shots to the chest and they desperately try to heal themselves, which in game mechanically you'd have all kinds of penalties on account of the bullets in your chest, right?
Yeah.
So they don't do a great job on account of they need healing.
Right.
And then somebody else comes along and can't help them more because it already got magically healed once. So there's some weird kind of speed bumps to it. You can't do mundane healing after magical healing either. So it's got to be
That was
mundane, then
fifth. I think they
magical.
got rid of that in
Did
sixth,
they?
right?
Okay. I'm
Yeah.
often speaking kind of just generically about most editions instead of any one.
However,
Yeah.
one of the things they did that I think balances what you said a little bit more about the magical healing as well is that depending on your essence and how much cyberware you have in you, it becomes a lot harder to heal
Yeah.
someone that isn't pure human.
Yeah. Which I'm kind of not crazy about, just from a game design perspective, unless having a low essence would also let you resist other spells that
Mm.
manipulate your body. Like I
Ooh.
can see why it makes it harder to heal you.
Yeah.
But then I feel like maybe it should affect some other stuff too. And
Yeah,
then you
I,
reach a
I agree
point
with
where
that.
you're kind of accidentally giving Street Samurai magic resistance, which may not be a bad thing, game balance wise, who knows? But it's definitely a different conversation.
Yeah, neat.
But yeah,
Oh,
it is
cool.
one that does come in because it's harder to magically heal somebody if you're trying to tailor that spell so that it doesn't also make the computer fall out of their head, right? If you're casting a spell on somebody and just saying, push the bullets out and repair the flesh, you don't want it to try and repair their augmentations, right?
Yeah.
So it makes sense that it'd be a little trickier.
We'll take notes on all of this and send them to Jason for
Yeah, sure.
awesome.
Uh,
So we talked a little bit about healing, both the magical and the mundane. I
yeah,
like the words of that, or the choice of words.
yeah,
So let's talk a little bit about the augmentations you can get. So BioWare, cyberware, what's the difference, and
yeah.
what does that do?
Cyberware is a little more classic, uh, including in genre, like in Shadowrun, in the first edition of Stuff. BioWare didn't come out until a couple splat books in, and it was kind of new and cool, and it worked differently. It didn't affect your essence score in the same way. It was a lot of extra math, and they've streamlined it luckily since then. But the easy way to think of it to me is that cyberware is more artificial stuff, whereas BioWare is replacement stuff. So
Mm.
BioWare is squishy, right? That's the gross way to think of it. You're welcome. But BioWare is a new vat grown heart that pumps
Mm.
better and is stronger and gives you a bonus on athletics rolls and whatever. Um, Whereas cyberware is like a real life pacemaker, right? Which is more of just a computer that does the job.
Mhm.
So that's the difference. And it's a little bit blurry with some augmentation. There's a muscle implant cyberware that's very similar to some bioware, but it's made of like artificial myomer Kevlar threads or whatever, as opposed to the bioware, which is like vat grown muscle. They're
Mhm.
like, oh, we got a genetic sample from Simone Biles, and then we fixed that up and we grew this, and now you've got that leg muscle, right? Or whatever. So one of them is more squishy, and cyberware is more crunchy. There you go. That's the worst but most accurate summary ever. Cyberware crunchy, bioware squishy.
Yeah.
Cyberware is also often called chrome because it'll
Mm.
literally be blinged out to look cool, right? Think of all the stuff that people do to their phone cases and their laptops and their cars these days. And now you're doing that to your cool new robot arm,
Mhm.
right? So you can have guys with like speakers in their arm that just play music everywhere they go, or Wolverine claws, by which I mean the classic metal ones, not the
I'd have a
bony ones. Those are
magnet to stick
different,
my phone to.
right? Yeah, that also charges your phone up,
Yeah,
right? Yeah,
right?
make it one of those. So the stuff that lets you interface with the Matrix and get all virtual reality on the magic internet, for lack of a better term, it's kind of what the Matrix is. That's almost always going to be cyberware.
Mhm.
So like the actual literal plug that you stick in your head that lets you do computer stuff has to be cyberware.
Mhm.
But you might have bioware that has affected your brain and gives you a bonus to like your logic attribute. And
Yeah.
that might still apply. So there's some spots where they overlap.
And if I'm correct, cyberware is less expensive than BioWare?
Most of the time, cyberware costs less money but more essence.
Mhm.
It's kind of worse for you, or it's more obvious. For
Mhm.
instance, you can have somebody with a bone density treatment that might just be like, I don't know, some super duper calcium shake, and then regenerative treatments, right? And then suddenly your bones are super strong. And you compare that to somebody kind of like Wolverine, who instead has like metal lacing on their bones, like
Yeah.
literally titanium.
Yeah.
And that's two different ways to do something. The end result is often pretty similar, but how you get there is going to change on your character sheet and affect your cost and your essence score. And also, it kind of affects, if you think about it, like, how do they lace your bones with impact resistant polymer? Like, they've kind of got to cut you way open, right? So you should have an awful lot of scars from that surgery compared to, hey, drink this protein shake with nanites in it or whatever,
Yeah.
So sometimes, it's going to be a different effect. You might have electronic cyber eyes that are kind of like, what's in a smartphone these days, right?
Mhm.
Including having filters. Jimmy Kincaid, my noir PI dude, he sees everything in grayscale. He just
Oh,
turned off the color on his cyber optics, so he sees everything like it's an old black and white flick. Um, and you could do that sort of thing, right?
awesome.
Um, or you might have vat grown cat eyes that help you see in the dark. So
Mm,
there's two different ways to see in the dark that
yeah.
can look very different on your character and let you do different stuff. So that's
Okay,
the
so
difference. Crunchy versus squishy.
gross.
Yeah,
Awesome.
super gross. That needs to be the name of a chapter now.
More notes for Jason.
Yeah.
All right, so the last thing that came up in the show today that I'd like to talk about is Dock Wagon, because I think they're fascinating. This is one of those, like,
Yeah.
when you hear about the Grid Overwatch division, it's like the scary boogeyman that's going to be sent after you, and Dock Wagon is like a good bad thing, and I love that mixture, and I'm always like, oh no, Dock Wagon, let everybody run
Yeah.
away. Tell us about what Dock Wagon is to you.
Yeah. Dock wagon is if an ambulance crew and a SWAT team made sweet love. You get Dock wagon, only also it's tied to your AAA membership,
Mm.
right? Like, you need to have a Dock wagon contract, but if you have that contract, when the poop hits the fan, these guys will literally come roaring at you out of the sky in a combat helicopter, depending on what type of neighborhood you're in. They'll come swooping in all Black Hawk down, and there'll be a team of half super badass Navy SEAL commando murder bots and half, you know, combat medics, and they will get your ass out of the fire and kill whoever's in their way, and then they will leave, and they will leave your team behind. They will kill your team if the team's like, hey, wait. They're like, we don't do that, and they'll just daka you, right? So they are very client focused, in a way that is faintly more dystopian than private ambulance services in real life, but not by much. We are getting closer all the time. Most ambulance services in real life are kind of like Lone Star or Knight Errant, and that they are companies that have gotten a contract to cover an area instead of being a public service. Look at your local ambulances, and you can see, like, a lot of them will have company logos or names instead of the town or the city or the county. So Dock Wagon is that, but also combat helicopters and super badass Navy SEAL dudes, right?
One of the fiction novellas that Jennifer Brozek did, and it's in one of the
Yeah.
anthologies, is called Dock Wagon 19.
Yeah.
And it's from the perspective of, I love this book. It's from the perspective of a anchor woman, a news anchor woman that goes live on the scene with Dock Wagon 19 and like is actually in and does some runs with them. And
Yeah.
it's a fascinating story. I love that one.
Yeah. And it's interesting, Dock Wagon, because on the one hand, they're super terrible and dystopian and terrifying because they've got a big budget and they've got a laser-like focus, right? A corporate security team has a lot going on, and they're trying to cover a whole facility and keep a whole facility safe and this, that, and the other. Dock Wagon has one job, and that is the mother fragger with a dock wagon bracelet on, right? So they will just roll into a scene. If a civilian with a dock wagon contract gets hit by a stray bullet when two gangs are duking it out, Dockwagon will just roll up and like use miniguns on both sides of the chopper, just tear everybody up. We don't care. We don't pay those fees. We've got the license for this contract. And they'll just rough up whoever they need to. And then I think one thing that again is to me really fascinating in a team-based game like Shadowrun, they don't care about your buddies. Like you need to have a dock wagon, contract ahead of time. If both members, or if a whole Shadowrun team gets chewed up, they'll just leave your buddies lying in the gutter. That's not their job. It's a very dystopian, I just work here. That's not my job type of thing. Like their job is the one person with the contract in that firefight. Everybody else is in the way.
I now really want a story or a game to be run. Maybe I'll run this for a group of mine where Dock Wagon goes in and people are in their way, so they start unloading and then get the ping that there's new contracts that need active because they shot someone.
Yeah. Like they probably have GPS stuff that warns them if it's a hot zone or a cold zone, because Dockwagon takes the location of people pretty seriously. But there's room for that. There's room for stories about the corporate extraterritoriality. I don't know how much it's come up in the game so far, but corporations are sovereign nations in Shadowrun. Like if you go to an office building run by Renraku, that's like an embassy in real life, right? Like that's Renraku territory. The laws of Seattle do not apply on their property. Their laws do. The cops of Seattle don't apply on their property. Their cops do. So it's a lot like embassies in real life, for lack of a better kind of analogy. College campuses get kind of close, but most campuses overlap law enforcement with real life stuff in real life with their city or county. But yeah, like they're their own legal entity. So Dockwagon has sometimes got some sticky stuff going on when it comes to them being able to rescue you, depending on where things go bad. If you're deep in a corporate building, you better have a super platinum contract, right? And those things run, 6 figures a year.
Yeah.
But you also got to think corporate citizens want Dockwagon protection. So there's probably licensing stuff going on between Dockwagon and Renraku or whoever that allows them to come in. And, so there's room for the GM to go different ways with it. And you could have a really tense scene where most of the crew needs to get their buddy out onto the street so Dockwagon can take them home to safety. Or you could have a different sort of story, with Dockwagon swooping in and, do what you want. It's Shadowrun has room for a bunch of different interpretations. And because every entity in Shadowrun is a bureaucracy, you can just make up whatever the heck you want, right? It's all corporations and of different sizes and how they all interact in their legalese and when they feel like throwing all that out the window. So let Dockwagon go where Dockwagon wants to, or make Dockwagon not go somewhere if that's a better story. GMs can do whatever they want, but awesome. Dockwagon's pretty cool.
Well, we only have a couple minutes left, so let's open it up to questions. I only see one in the chat right now, but feel free to drop in for the next couple moments here. So this is from our friend Big Red 40 Tack. Man, what is with me and names today? It's good to see you, friend. And he asks, what would be the biggest change that you, Russell, would make to the setting if you had the power to?
I kind of do, just on my own scale is the weird part, right? Like it's most of the changes that I would want to make, I tend to think small in game worlds. An analogy I've used in the past is I tend to think like a player instead of a GM.
Mm.
That's my mindset. So like the stories that I write tend to be very small and focused on a character or whatever. So for me, I tend to look at things at a very kind of micro scale, and the changes that I make or have made have been small enough that they fly, like it works. Um, oh man, if one enormous change that I could make to Shadowrun, what would it be? The biggest one I can think of, and this is very much a go big moment, would be a reboot. Honestly, just turn the knob back to 2050, and that would be messy as hell, and a lot of people would be super pissed off, and it would be very difficult because you don't want to like new 52 it in the DC sense, and you don't want to like Marvel Ultimate Universe, So I don't know how it would work, or what the answer would be, but I think there's an awful lot of meta plot crammed into real time. For those that aren't familiar with Shadowrun, the timeline has advanced basically year by year since the books started to be published in 1989.
Mm-hmm.
So when the first books came out, it was 2050, and now it's 2080. So it's advanced, and sometimes that's really cool. Um, I met my wife playing Shadowrun, and our characters had a little girl. That little girl is now grown up and a character in several of my fiction pieces because she's in her early 20s, right? Like it's so sometimes the timeline thing is really neat. But the other thing is that stuff happens in an RPG setting, right? When an edition changes, especially, there's huge changes that tend to happen. And the timeline of Shadowrun is just punch after punch after punch of big, awful thing. And yet, what we're trying to also do is make the game feel familiar to the nerds that have been playing it since 1989, right?
Yeah.
So we're at this weird thing where tech should be advancing, but if it advances too much, it doesn't feel like Shadowrun anymore. So, like, in fourth edition, there's nanites everywhere, but in sixth edition, the essence and Nuyen cost of most basic cyberware is the same as it was in SR1, right? Like it's just some weird stuff going on, when there should be like exponential change. And I think that there's a point of diminishing returns with that. And I think the same thing about like most comic books,
Mm.
right? It's a very similar thing where you've got a shared universe that's trying to tell nothing but unchanging, iconic stories. And that's pretty fucking hard. Sorry if I'm not supposed to drop the F bomb. I just realized I'd never checked. But yeah,
You're good. We're good on this channel.
it's hard to always tell a Batman story that's cool, but never fundamentally changes Batman, right? And I think that it's just as hard to tell 35 years of stories in Shadowrun, advancing real time, so there's never a downtime for the world to catch its breath, which is a cheat that Battletech has used because it has advanced generations. And then it goes back later, and some of us fill in the downtime with short stories, right? Check out Shrapnel. It's a little quarterly magazine full of little stories that a bunch of us tell, right?
Yeah.
But yeah,
I like that idea too, because I think that there's some things that have happened in the timeline that have been predictive. Yeah. And I think that's super cool. And knowing what we know now, if we were to rewrite the next X amount of years, what would change about it? But also, I think that, like, for instance, for me, we're playing in the Shadowrun Origins podcast in the 2050s. Yeah. And it's really hard right now because there's things that we can do now in 2023 that in Shadowrun 2050s you can't do. It's not wireless. And I'm like, I can't do, let me plug into a wall.
Yeah, and it just need to, and I think just like a hard reboot fixes some of that. And also, and this is, I don't want to say it's more personal or whatever, it's my preference. It would also let us walk back some of the problematic elements of a setting that was pretty forward thinking for the 1980s, but pretty forward thinking for the 1980s kind of doesn't cut it anymore.
Yeah.
And there's still a lot that could have been done different.
Yeah.
The original creators were very well intended and were very forward thinking for the 1980s, but there's still a lot of stuff in the stuff that I'm writing right now set in the Mojave. It's in the Native American nations, which is most of the continent of North America. But all through the old source books about these people, they're called the Anasazi tribes. And the Anasazi in real life isn't the name of the tribe that we white people call the Anasazi. It's the name of their tribe, which I even hate the word tribe instead of tribal nation. But anyways, it means like enemy, right? So it's like if someone asked, "Oh yeah, no, this is the United States of stupid dum dum face," and that's what made it into every history book ever, right? So like it's hard when you cringe a little every time you're writing something. So I'm walking it back. I'm explaining some of it in this book, and try to smooth it over. And my last big trilogy, a trilogy of novellas, the Blackbird trilogy, which is super cool paramilitary stuff, I actually think is a pretty good intro for new Shadowrun fans
Mhm.
because it starts with a little boy in the 2020s growing up and it ends 60 years later.
Yeah.
So it bounces you around the timeline. But in that one, I was dealing with some of that Native American stuff. And I ended up finding, for instance, some stickball channels on YouTube and reaching out to some Native Americans that know the game of stickball and sending them a chapter of my novella to read over to go, hey, is this an okay representation of the sport? So you do what you can, and Shadowrun is a lot better about it than it could be. But yeah, I think a hard reboot also gives you a little bit of an opportunity to rework
Mhm.
some of the problematic stuff and just make the game a little more accessible and a little more comfortable for a lot of people.
Awesome. Thank you. So our last question that we'll take is from Earthquake Johnson. Welcome to the chat, friend. I've played the Shadowrun game on PC. Would you say that's an accurate representation of the tabletop roleplay experience of the universe? Tempted to pick up some books.
Um, it is not an accurate representation of the mechanics, in that it's like, a percentile based on screen when you're playing the PC games and that sort of thing. But it does absolutely just drip with the feel of the
Yeah.
setting. And here I'm talking the second two more than the first one. The story in Hong Kong and stuff is just a lot better than the story in the initial Shadowrun Returns. But yeah, it's the anthology. Actually, I have a story in there. But they, not that Jordan Weissman, one of the original creators of Shadowrun, needed it, but they did contact a lot of us Shadowrun writers, and we kind of consulted and we wrote short fiction that went into it. I actually have an email that I will probably never delete, and I might print someday, of Jordan Weissman asking me a lore question about Shadowrun. So this is one
Awesome.
of the original creators of this game from a million years ago. This game that I grew up loving since I was, 13. But yeah, so they went out of their way to include us, to keep things as accurate as possible for the timeline moving forward.
Cool.
It is best to think of Dragonfall in Hong Kong. Think of the Shadowrun Returns trilogy as its own universe a little bit, in a kind of multiversal sense, right? And it fits a little bit better. But yeah, they got the character down pat. The aesthetic is amazing. Again, especially in the later game. The slang is there, the vibe. Yeah,
I
it's all really neat.
And for you,
Yeah.
depending on what your personal preferences for gameplay, like the world, the lore is so deep and it's there. But in terms of mechanic, what we're doing for the Realmsmith stream, excommunication, is we're using mostly anarchy with a few 6th edition rules sprinkled in. So if you like rules light, that's the one to go with and tell your cyberpunk fantasy stories. But if you like all of the big chunky crunchy mechanics, then Shadowrun 6th World is the beginner box is a great place to start. Dip your toe in and see if that's the mechanic system for you, and if so, there's so many books to go with from there. So thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. Anything you want to pitch, Rusty, before we say goodnight?
I am going to pitch the Shadowrun PC games since they just came up, because you can normally find them for dirt heckin' cheap. So if you've been enjoying the show and you think Shadowrun looks cool, go find them on Steam or wherever, because you can get them for next to nothing. So pick up Hong Kong and Dragonfall and go to town. So there's that. For my own stuff, I don't know, man. I don't necessarily want to pitch any one thing because I've got so much in the pipeline right now. But especially with BattleTech also. But I've got plenty of Shadowrun stuff still coming. I'm working on 4 Shadowrun novels right now. So there's plenty of it coming, but I don't want to spoil anything. And I might even still change the names of some of these novels because that's who I am as a person. So I don't know, just go check Drive-Thru RPG or Amazon for Russell Zimmerman and buy anything you think looks neat.
Awesome. Love it. Really recommend Rusty's work and getting to watch him play in things and tell stories and stuff. He's a legend in Shadowrun and now migrating into BattleTech, which is going to be really cool for that world as well. So, or those worlds, there's so many. Yeah. So thank you so much for joining us, Russell, and thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next week. We've got a really exciting special guest next week on the Realmsmith Excommunication stream. So tune in, and until then, stay safe in the shadows. Bye, everyone.